Um, Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the third Republican Socialist discussion. You may recall that last time we had a look at politics in Scotland, and today we're going to have a look at the current situation in Ireland. And we've invited Dr. Joseph Healy, who is Left Unity International Officer. He's also a member of Unite Union, and he's the treasurer of the Irish LGBT network. So without more ado from me, I'm going to ask Joe to tell this story about Ireland. Okay, Joe.
Right. Well, thank you for the invite, Steve. I suppose I'm going to give a fairly subjective talk in the sense that I will illuminate the recent history of Ireland, certainly of the Irish Republic, with that of my own, and how the two parallel each other really. And I was born in Dublin in the late 50s, and the Ireland I grew up in was a very different Ireland to the one today. It was very permeated with Republican ideology, with the images of the heroes of the 1916 rebellion. It was the memories of the Irish Civil War were still very deep, and in fact, the whole political infrastructure was mirrored on the divisions which had happened during that Civil War, so that you had the two main parties, Fianna Fáil, which was the party of De Valera, effectively the losers of the Civil War, and the other party, Fine Gael, being the party of Michael Collins, the winners of the Civil War. And the Ireland I grew up in, we had, one could almost say, our own Republican iconography. We had a Republican plot, it was called the burial plot for the heroes of the 1916 rebellion in Arbor Hill. And I remember as a child being taken on a rainy, cold day to visit that Republican plot and to see where all the leaders were buried, and also the Kilmainham jail nearby, where of course many of them were executed in 1916, including famously James Connolly, both the leader of the Citizens' Army, famous Irish socialist, who was executed tied to a chair because he was so badly wounded he couldn't stand up for the firing squad. And one memory that's etched in my memory really is the reburial of Roger Casement, who was taken from London, where he'd been buried in the grounds of Pentonville Prison, and given a state funeral in Ireland in the 60s, which we all attended as children and so on, and it was seen as a great historic event where he was finally interred with the other heroes of the 1916 rebellion. And it was very much an Ireland I grew up in under the shadow of De Valera, Eamon De Valera. He had been head of state. He'd been the Taoiseach, the prime minister, for many years. And by the time I was going to school, he was much older, and he was the president, head of state. And sort of illustrate the division in Irish politics, I remember the night he died, being in a pub where the pub divided clearly into two halves, one half drinking to his memory and seeing him as the great leader, the great statesman, and the other half, which I was part of, saying, well, celebrating his end, basically. But that illustrated the deep divisions which remained in Irish politics. And an interesting factor in all of this is that when I was growing up, there were pictures of De Valera everywhere. He was still, very much the father of the nation almost. Whereas now, or certainly in the last 10 to 20 years, it's the reverse. I mean, very, very few images of De Valera anywhere, but a lot more images of Michael Collins. So it's a bit, as one's reputation has faded, the others has gone up, and I think that's an interesting commentary on the way that Irish politics and Irish history has gone, or how people regard Irish history. Of course, De Valera's Ireland, which was still very much the Ireland I grew up in, was very dominated by the Catholic Church. De Valera had made, in fact, a concordat with the Church that, it was a Catholic, deeply Catholic sectarian state, and the government and the ministers acted at the behest of the church and of the bishops. It was a well-known fact that if the Catholic hierarchy didn't like something, they would contact the government minister responsible immediately and try and block it or change it or whatever. And that was reflected very much in the northern state, Northern Ireland, where, it was a parallel state, also a sectarian state, where it was the other way around, where, the Protestant churches very much dominated the agenda, and it was a very clearly anti-Catholic state. And my family had no direct history in the War of Independence or the Civil War or so on, but the only footnote really from my family's history was that my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was arrested during the War of Independence in 1920 by the British and was going to be executed. And the reason for that was because a famous guerrilla fighter, Dan Breen, who wrote a well-known book, My Fight for Irish Freedom, had been hidden in one of the houses on my grandfather's street and had managed to escape by jumping out the back through a glass house and being pursued by the Black and Tans, who broke into all the houses. And then when they found Breen had been wounded, managed to escape, he recounts all of this in his book, by the way, and he dropped his pistol in my grandfather's garden, and of course that was sufficient for my grandfather to be arrested. And at the time, Ireland was under martial law, so a military court decided he was to be executed. And the only reason why he managed to survive was my grandmother went to see the Archbishop of Dublin, who interceded with the British Commander-in-Chief, and his life was spared. But that was a reflection of the way things were at that time. But my family were not directly political, although I always grew up with a political awareness. And my grandfather on the other side, on my mother's side, had grown up as a barefoot peasant, basically, in County Kerry, in the deep south. And he recounted a story throughout his life that he'd seen a British customs officer at the time, with a gold pocket watch. And he said that he was determined that he would get a similar job with a gold pocket watch. And he ended up, in the end, as collector of customs for Dublin Port, which was probably one of the most senior positions, if not the most senior position, in the Irish Customs Service. And I remember visiting him in his wood-panelled office in the famous Customs House, the 18th century building there on the quays in Dublin, one of Dublin's most famous landmarks. And when he crossed the border into the north, customs officers would salute him as he went through. And our only contact with the north, for most of us in the Republic, or certainly for those of us in Dublin, was when we would go for minor smuggling operations up to the border towns, because in those days, there were exotic things like English biscuits and sweets and so on, which you couldn't get in the Republic. So my mother would regularly drive across the border with a blanket in the boot for covering up the merchandise, and engage in a purchasing round. Most people went to Newry, which is a town just inside the border, and Newry did a roaring trade in visitors from the south. And then we would have to pass through the customs posts, where there would be sometimes a cursory inspection, but my mother would, usually by covering up everything, would manage to smile nicely and sail through. Anyway, we were never caught. But for most of us, that was our very limited experience of the north. It seemed like a very different place. And I think, in subsequent years, when the trouble started, obviously nobody from the south would go to the north. I mean, there were very, very few people indeed who would travel, unless you were an actual smuggler. I mean, in the border counties, the smuggling trade continued. But I actually started going up there in the late 70s, making contacts with people there and so on. And I wasn't there in the worst period, which was in the sort of earlier 70s, but certainly by the late 70s and early 80s, it was still quite bad. And I was traveling up there, and I would see things like the searches going on in the cafes, and the border patrols and the roadblocks and all that sort of thing. So I did experience firsthand what it was like in that very dark period of Irish history. So as I said, Ireland, I think, has changed enormously. And what I think the major thing that's changed is that the power of the Catholic Church began to break down. I think the catalyst for that really was, I mean, there were already forces of modernization happening, but I think the series of scandals that broke with the Catholic Church around sexual abuse of children and so on, and that reached its apogee in the story of the Magdalen laundries, which were laundries attached to convents, which had a slave labor force of what they called fallen women. I mean, women who were either single parents or who were deemed to be immoral or whatever. They would effectively be handed over by their families with the state sanctioning it to be in permanent imprisonment, really, in these laundries where they would work for the religious orders and deliver laundry to some of the best hotels and all the rest. So, they made an absolute killing out of it. And these poor, unfortunate people were condemned to serve their lives out there. Now, when all of this became public, I mean, of course, there were people who knew it was happening, but for the majority of society, we're not aware of the full details. And when all of these scandals became out, really, the church's position was shaken very severely. And I myself was a survivor because I attended one of these schools where abuse was rife. And the Irish state actually did something about that, which is fairly unique in that they set up a state-funded system of compensation, where funds were paid in by both the Catholic Church, although to my mind the Catholic Church didn't pay anything like the amount it should have, and the rest was financed by the state. And they set up a tribunal system, which actually providing lawyers to complainants, and actually set about offering compensation to the thousands of victims who'd been through that system, many of whom had ended up in England anyway, because the first thing that most people did when they left these institutions or managed to escape from the Magdalen laundries or whatever was get the boat to England. Now, this brings me to the sort of economic point, is that the Ireland of since independence, since the 20s, certainly up until the 70s, had experienced mass emigration. One of the biggest waves was in the 1950s, just when I was a child, really. And I've always said that in Irish history, whenever there's an economic crash, about every 30 years, there's another wave of emigration. And that's certainly been the case, that there was one in the 20s, one in the 50s, one in the 80s, of which I'm a part, and then again one after the financial crash in 2008. And it's always been the safety valve in terms of both Irish economics and politics, that those people who are the most impacted through unemployment, and often the youth, leave the country, traditionally heading for the United States or the UK. But that changed with the last crash, where most people emigrated to either Canada or Australia. In fact, Canada was very, very keen to have Irish migrants and was offering quite generous work visas, as was Australia at the time. So that pattern has continued. I think that will be more difficult this time, because I think Ireland is about to be hit by, the double whammy of no deal Brexit and the general economic crisis. So I think it'll be much more difficult this time for that safety valve to be activated, because there are not many places now that a large percentage of Irish unemployed can travel to. So it'll be interesting to see what the economic and political impact of that will be. But as the Catholic Church's power decreased, more radical movements gathered momentum. The feminist movement, the LGBT movement, and so on began to challenge the status quo of Holy Catholic Ireland. And the first indication of that really was the referendum on equal marriage in 2015, where the church pulled out all the stops to prevent that happening and failed. And in fact, virtually every area of Ireland voted in favour of the constitutional amendment. And then that was followed by the abortion referendum, which many progressive people thought would be very difficult to win, but in fact it did. So those were two seismic changes really in the nature and makeup of Irish society. And of course, that had an impact north of the border because the traditional unionist bogeyman was, home rule is Rome rule. The southern state is a deeply sectarian Catholic state, and so on, in which no non-Catholic or Protestant can have any sense of equality. And of course, as Ireland has changed into a much more modern European state, that whole narrative has collapsed. And it is one of the reasons, I think, why increasingly moderate unionists in the north see the Irish state, a reunified Ireland, as a more attractive proposition than being tied to what they see as a imperialist, soaked, nostalgic Britain, which seems, caught in the 1950s in this sepia vision of empire and so on. And so I think that, I think the whole question of Brexit raised a lot of issues in the north about Irish identity and the European nature as well of Ireland, because I think Ireland has always had far stronger ties with continental Europe than England. And if you look back at that, you'll see that stretching all the way back to the Spanish and French interventions militarily and so on in Irish history, where the Irish chiefs and Irish clans have usually ganged up with either Spain or France to fight England. And of course, this created the whole English fear about, Ireland is the back door to England for continental invaders and so on. But the fact is that there is a cultural and historic tie with continental Europe, with the fact that when Gaelic Ireland ended in the early 17th century, the chiefs emigrated to Spain, and many Irish subsequently went to Catholic universities on the continent, in Spain, in France, in the Low Countries, and so on. So there's always been that historical link. And there isn't this fear of Europe that there has been in, say, in English identity or English nationalism, which has come to the fore again in recent years. So I think that I'm not saying, of course, that there are not major economic problems in Ireland, and there are, and it's the fact that we've had two conservative parties, effectively Tweedledum and Tweedledee, running the country since the 1920s, has meant that there has been very little real economic change. So there has been traditionally, as I said, very high rates of unemployment and immigration and so on. That has changed more recently to a pattern of low-wage economy, a very important hospitality and tourist sector. Ireland is very, very dependent. Ireland's two major industries are probably agriculture and tourism. And those conservative parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have kept in place a system where, there's a real housing crisis now, especially in Dublin, where 1/3 of the population live. It's virtually impossible for young people to find accommodation with very, very high property prices, probably equaling those of London. And of course, the other big problem is corporation tax, where the Irish government has had a clear economic policy of very, very low corporation tax, which has attracted a lot of multinationals to base their European headquarters in Dublin. So we end up with Google and Twitter and so on having their European headquarters in Dublin, which has led to a boom in business properties and things like that. But for ordinary workers, it has not been a good time. Now, what has happened, of course, is that paralleling the social changes I mentioned in terms of the referenda and so on, there has been a political shift, particularly in the last general election, where Sinn Féin emerged. Traditionally, the Irish left had not been very strong, but in the last election, Sinn Féin emerged as the party with the largest number of votes. And up until very recently, you could safely say that 70% of the vote would be shared between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. This time that was not the case. Their vote fell substantially. And so we now have a coalition government where the two Civil War parties have effectively been forced to cohabit, along with the Greens, and facing down now a left opposition led by Sinn Féin. But it has effectively ended the Civil War politics because the two Conservative parties have finally been forced to come together. Now that will change the whole dynamic of Irish politics in that Sinn Féin will now be seen as the leading party of the left. And if the current government continues with policies of austerity and so on, which seems quite likely, and I've written an article about this recently, it's been on the Mutiny website, about the role of the Irish Greens in that government. If that government continues those policies of alienating the youth and the unemployed and so on, then I think in the next election, Sinn Féin will do very, very well and will probably be the government party. And of course, that will have major reverberations in the north as well, with a party which clearly has a policy of reuniting Ireland and supporting a border poll.
Okay, I'd like to thank you, Joe, for that. We'll be putting that onto YouTube, and hope we'll be sending it around to comrades to listen to it. Thank you very much for that talk. It was very interesting. And
You're welcome, Steve.
we'll be in touch soon. All right. Okay, thank you.